What's up, everybody? What's up, everybody? Sunday night, 11:41 Central Time. Good evening. Good evening. Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. Good evening. Good evening. I took a big nap today, so I'm awake. So I was gonna read a little bit of this Luther biography. See how it goes. So let's give it a whirl. Little Martin Luther, born in 1483. 1483. Y'all ready to rock and roll? Let's do this. It says, let's see, child, 1483 to, let me read the introduction. It's just one page. It says, Luther was a problem, certainly for the Pope and the Emperor, but often he was also a problem for his fellow reformers. Prone to outbursts of rage and coarse language, Luther was frequently stubborn and undiplomatic, even with allies. As one fellow reformer put it, he's a person who often loses his path and who is reluctant to consider a return. He's a human who fears God uprightly and earnestly seeks his honor, but becomes irritated the moment he is reprimanded. This is how God gave him to us, and this is how we will have to use him. There you go. Hey, Faye Carney, good evening, good evening. It says, the man who had to learn humility, take his book sleeve off, excuse me. The man who had to learn humility as a monk had an ego that combined with his quick temperament to swiftly make enemies and exasperate even his most intimate circle of friends. Quote, we must and we will take him the way he is, John Calvin remarked. Quote, because it was Luther who gave the gospel back to us. So there you go, Krista. What up? What up? Good evening, Krista Taman. Good to have you on. Reading a little Martin Luther, 1483. This is born in 1483. So yeah, this is the introduction, just one page. It's a really short introduction. It says, of course, Luther could only, quote unquote, give back the gospel to the church after he had found it himself. And he had long been searching for it. He was a man searching for God. Luther was a phenomenon, a fascinating human being. His opponents thought so too. Luther consistently displayed a brilliant richness of thought, a command of language, and an irascible humor. He was honest about his struggles of faith, often using them to comfort and encourage others. The same ego that could sometimes alienate people also buffered his sense of calling and resolve, enabling him to achieve an astonishing number of accomplishments in his life. Pretty cool. The temptation for any biographer of Luther is to merely let the reformer speak for himself. In this biography, I have attempted both to reveal Luther in his own words and to give the reader an objective portrait. My hope is that I have at least achieved a balance. It should be said at the outset that this is a biography of Martin Luther and not a history of the Reformation. Though, of course, we cannot understand Luther without at least a basic understanding of the historical context that formed him. The translations from Luther's works, letters, and table talk are nearly all mine. The endnotes indicate where I used existing translations. Translating Luther is nearly impossible since his German and Latin are as dynamic as the man himself. I hope some of the dynamism comes through in this book. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. So there we go. Martin Luther by Selderhuis. 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 Probably butchered that name. But either way. It says, it's titled, it says his childhood, I guess, 1483 to 1500. Then the subtitle here is Devils Everywhere. And it reads this way: God, the devil, and death were everyday topics in the world into which Martin Luther was born. As a child, Luther learned that God was a judge more righteous than merciful. The devil was out to snatch your soul and turn women into witches. Death was not the end of life, Luther was taught, but instead it was the moment you appear before God and enter purgatory. With these dour lessons firmly in his head, is it any surprise that years later Luther would say that every mention of God was, quote, as a slap of thunder in his heart, end quote. The lowercase g God that Martin Luther was told to believe in as a child was a lowercase g God who signaled his righteousness chiefly through punishment. The presence of devils and witches certainly did not make life more pleasant. Luther grew up regularly hearing and thinking about Satan. In Luther's time, stories from the Bible and folklore had been blended together to create many terrifying representations of the devil and his cohorts. Miners who worked in darkness deep underground were terrified at the thought of meeting an evil spiritual being. Among other things, Luther was taught that the pealing of church bells would drive out demons, that the devil influenced the weather, and that he could command the cattle. Luther also believed that a witch had poisoned his brother, almost certainly following the beliefs of his mother, who was convinced that a neighbor was secretly a witch, prying on the Luther children. The neighbor appeared again in 1533, comment recorded in Luther's Table Talk. Quote, here's a paragraph from that. It says, Dr. Martinus told us a lot about sorcery, about anxiety, and about elves, and that his mother had had so many problems with a neighbor who was a sorceress. Therefore, his mother had to do her utmost to remain on good terms with the neighbor by being friendly and forgiving. Whenever the neighbor took one of her children onto her lap, she screamed bloody murder. This woman punished a preacher without even mentioning his name and cast a spell on him, so he had to die. He couldn't be helped with any medicine. She had taken dirt from the ground where he had walked, threw it in water, and bewitched him. Because without that earth, he could not become better again. Fascinating. Oh, man. The accusation of witchcraft devastated many women in Luther's day, and some paid for the rumors with their lives. In the culture in which Martin Luther was raised, the devil was everywhere and behind everything, Luther relates. When I was still a boy, a story was told that there was no way that the devil could cause a quarrel between a man and his wife who really loved each other. Nevertheless, he managed to make it happen using an old woman who put a razor under both their pillows and then told them that they were there. The man found it and murdered his wife. Weird. Then the devil came and, using a long stick, gave the old woman a pair of shoes. When she asked why he wouldn't come near her, he answered her, quote, because you are worse than I, because you accomplished something with that man and woman that I couldn't. In this way, we see once again that the devil is always the enemy of everything that the Lord God brought about. That's interesting. That's different. All right. Luther had difficulty throwing off such superstition, but over time, he eventually gained a more theologically responsible view of spiritual warfare. Luther would write that he viewed his frequent stomach ailments as direct attacks from the devil. According to Luther, that struggle happened especially when he was sitting on the latrine, where he spent quite some time due to his intestinal issues, alternating between constipation and diarrhea. Luther experienced many physical struggles in that place, and he saw those struggles as attacks of Satan on his work. Moreover, the devil likes nothing more than to envelope people in a noxious stench, and he manages that especially on the latrine. A person tries his utmost quietly and privately to have his bowel movement, but subsequently Satan begins to stir in it so that everyone, especially God, will notice that there is a bad smell hanging around him. That is too much. The imagery of the latrine as a place where Satan does his filthy work and where a person experiences his lowly position was not new and was already present in a medieval psalm. What was new was Luther's discovery that this was also the place where the Holy Spirit taught him to combat Satan by trusting in Christ. Before he would come that far, however, would still have to take place in Luther's life. All right, a few details. A few details. Little can be said about Luther's earliest years, simply because we know little about them. He is what Luther wrote in a letter about his first years. Quote, I was born in Eisleben and also baptized there, namely in St. Peter's Church. Of course, I cannot remember anything about this, but I believe my parents and the other people from my native town, my parents moved to the neighborhood of Eisenach because most of my family live in Eisenach. And they all knew me and still know me because I went to school there for 4 years. And no other city knows me as well as this one. The time after this, I spent at the University of Erfurt and in the monastery there until I came to Wittenberg. I also went to Magdeburg for a year, but I was 14 then. Here you have my life story and where I came from. There you go. Fortunately, we know more about the young Luther than sentences indicate. He recounted a lot in his letters, but also in his so called table talk, which is a famous as it is notorious. Luther did leave us some memory of his earliest years, though it is debatable how much of what he says about himself is accurate. Name and face. In Luther's time, surnames varied more in spelling and pronunciation than they do today. Luther's father, Hans, wrote his surname as Luder, Loder, Ludher, Lotter, Luther, or Lothar, reflecting the cultural habit of spelling names as they sound. When Martin Luther himself began publishing, it was more important to have a consistently spelled name. Thus, from 1517 onward, he used Luther, Luther, exclusively, save for a brief time in which he indulged a mildly elitist habit of using a pen name, Eulotherius, a wordplay on the Greek for free man. In time, Luther would feel the name to distance himself yet again from his name. He was bothered that he had become synonymous with the Reformation. Luther wrote that everyone who realized that he was bound to the rediscovered Christian truth, quote, must be silent concerning my name and should not call himself Lutheran, but Christian. What is Luther? Does the doctrine belong to me? I have not been crucified for anyone. How would I, as a poor, sinful bag of maggots, this is the way Luther viewed his body, allowed people, the children of Christ, to bear my unwholesome name? I am no master and don't want to be one either. Together with the congregation, I share in the universal doctrine of Christ, and he alone is our master. Very good. Regardless of Luther's sentiment, those who followed in his theological legacy would continue to bear his name, Lutherans. What did Luther look like? In a time in which we are awash with photographs, it's almost unimaginable that someone would reach 37 years of age before appearing in his first portrait. In Luther's time, however, most people were never painted. The images we have of Martin Luther were all made by Lucas Cranach the Elder, 1472 to 1553, the famous court painter of the Elector. The first shows us a scrawny monk with tonsure and serious-looking eyes. This is an image with a message. Here stands a serious man and not a heretic with wild plans. Then, as now, portraits and images were part of the public relations division. Gradually, Luther becomes fatter. It seems as if the insight that a person cannot earn his way into heaven by means of fasting had convincingly tempted Luther into a calorie-rich lifestyle. That's a nice little pun there, nice little joke. It would also become evident that his innards would have difficulty adapting to these foods. He continues to look serious in the portraits, both the ones portraying him as professor and those in which he appears as a married man, clearly a man you could trust. At least that is the message conveyed in the portraits. They also picture a man whose look makes you restless. In the spring of 1523, a representative from the Polish king visiting Luther wrote, quote, "His face is like his books. His eyes are penetrating and glitter almost fearfully, as you sometimes see with lunatics." Oh, it's great. So here's a picture of him. Pretty nice, huh? Luther, what up, Luther? There you go. Uganda's in the house. What's up, bro? What up, Uganda? It says origins. I am the son of a farmer. My great grandfather, my grandfather, and my father were real farmers. Actually, I should have become a village head, a sheriff, or whatever they would have in a village. A function that would have placed me just a bit higher than others. But my father moved to Mansfeld, and he became a miner. That's where I come from. Now and again, Luther would recount something about his origins and his childhood. But as those descriptions were almost totally dependent on his memory, the images he created did not always fit with reality. Luther said, for example, that his parents were not well off. Quote, "In his youth, my father was a poor miner. On her back, my mother carried all the firewood home. That's the way we were brought up. They endured a lot of difficulty that the world today does not want to endure anymore." In reality, it appears that the poverty suffered by his parents was not as bad as he claimed. Hans Luther, 1459 to 1530, was not a simple miner as portrayed by his son, but rather was the enterprising son who had come out of a fairly prosperous farmer's family. He lived in Mora in Thuringia, and at 20 years old, he married Margaretha Lindemann, 1460, 1531, also 20. She came from a middle class family in Eisenach. Her brothers were jurists. She was neither the child of bitter poverty mentioned by some of Luther's more romantic biographers, nor the whore of the bathhouse invoked by some of Luther's theological enemies. Luther's father had a younger brother, and in accordance with local inheritance customs, the farm went to the youngest brother, not the eldest. Subsequently, Hans sought employment in copper mining, a growing industry in the county of Mansfeld, which was rich with copper and would thus see a major economic resurgence. Like many other families, the Luthers moved to Mansfeld and purchased a mine. On November 10th, the Luther's second son was born. He was baptized the next day, November 11th, on the feast of St. Martin. Hans and Margarethe named their newborn son after the saint. The baptism took place close by in the St. Peter and Paul Church. In that time, a child's birthday was associated with a saint's day and was deemed to be more important than the actual birth year. Hence, it is not definite that Luther was born in 1483, as virtually every biography has claimed. According to newer research, there are good reasons to believe that Luther was actually born a year later in 1484. 1484. Here's a picture of his parents. Hans Luther, father of portrait, and Margaret Luther, Luther's mother. Paintings by Lucas Cranach the Elder, 1527. Here you go. Some old cat. Boom. Martin Luther's parents in Germany. Mansfeld. Very, very interesting. So they are going to start doing the copper mining thing. Whatever year he was born, a year after his birth, the family moved a couple of miles farther to Mansfeld, a small city with approximately 2,000 inhabitants. There, Hans received a leadership position in the copper mines, thanks to one of Margaret's uncles. 7 years later, he owned 3 copper smelters, 200 acres of land, a large farm, a number of buildings, and enough capital to become a uh, prodigious leader. It's not clear exactly how large the family became, but we do know that Martin had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. The family's relative prosperity has been confirmed by archaeological analysis of the family refuse pit, uh, in which was found 7,000 food remains, and clearly testified to the diverse and luxurious meals they would have often enjoyed. Fascinating. Fascinating. Nevertheless, the times were not always plentiful. Hans was weighed by significant debt, which accrued in the down seasons of the mining business. It would be a mistake to assume that the Luthers lived like royalty. While they enjoyed some variety of food, they also faced economically challenging times. Without any question, Luther experienced periods of poverty at home, that his parents had to work hard even when they were financially better off is obvious from the look on their faces in these portraits. As mentioned above, Luther would recollect years later that his mother gathered firewood and carried it home every day. This shouldn't be interpreted as a sign of destitution, but as a typical life for this heiress middle class family. Makes sense. Impression. Why did Luther give the impression that he had lived his early life in extreme poverty? The best answer is that this description of his life fit his image of himself. Luther wanted to be known as a man who, though the son of a poor, ignoble father, was nevertheless able to successfully oppose a powerful pope and emperor. Luther enjoyed drawing this kind of contrast about himself. Quote, I admit that I am the son of a farmer from Mora near Eisenach, and yet I am a doctor in the Holy Scriptures and an enemy of the Pope. Luther knew that this, quote, David and Goliath narrative was appealing. At the same time, it would be a mistake, as we will see later, to simply dismiss Luther's account as trustworthy. Tourists today can visit the town of Eisleben, where Luther was born and where he died. Shortly before his birth, Luther's family came to Eisleben, and only a few months later, they had already left. The house that is now shown as his birthplace is the correct location, but it is not actually the house in which he was born, which burned down in 1689. Moreover, Luther did not die in the house that they now show as his place of death. He died a few houses down the street, and immediately after his death, they brought him to the house that is now claimed to be the place of his death. Not everything fits, but it is close enough to make a good story. All in all, Eisleben did not actually play a primary role in Luther's life like Mansfeld did. It was there that he grew up until he was 14, when he went to Erfurt to study, approximately 55 miles from home. He was registered as Martin Luther from Mansfeld. Very nice. Strict. While Luther's claims of family poverty were exaggerated, his claims of strictness and discipline in his upbringing almost certainly were not. A common form of corporal punishment in Luther's day was a rap on the knuckles. Whether this was an effective method of discipline is questionable, but it certainly made an impression on the young Luther. Quote, my parents brought me up so strictly that it sometimes scared me. My mother once hit me until I bled simply because I had secretly taken a nut. Because of this hard-nosed discipline, they finally drove me into the monastery. Even though they meant well, it made me scared. They did not know the appropriate relationship between someone's character and the manner in which one should be disciplined. You should punish in such a way that you place the apple beside the rod. Nice. Luther would later record that his father had berated him in frustration for over an hour. The reformer was not bitter about such parenting, and he even admitted that his father had the right to do that, because this little hour was insignificant over against the 10 years of work that his father had to devote to him. Besides, this outburst of rage had not harmed him. This should call question the very common claim that Luther's strict upbringing had imparted to him a psychological problem that had shaped his idea of God. Aside from the fact that four remarks about a person's upbringing are rather meager data on which to build a psychological profile, there is little evidence of neurosis or other complexes when Luther talks with and about his parents later on. The comforting letter he wrote to his father when he was afraid to die says enough. Luther was relieved to hear that his father, shortly after the reading of this letter, died peacefully and in faith. Luther's opinion of his father is made clear in a letter dated June 5th, 1530, to his colleague Philip Melanchthon. When he heard that his father had passed away, quote, "Today Hans Rennick wrote me that my dear father, Hans Luther, the old man, has left this life on Sunday, Exaudi, May 29th, exactly at 1 o'clock. His death has made me extremely sad, not only because of my father's nature, but also because of his unique affectionate love, and because through him, my Creator has given me everything that I am and have. And even though it comforts me that he writes that he died in Christ in the strength of his faith, the grief and the memories of that extremely loving relationship with him has affected me intimately, so much that I have hardly ever despised death as now. But, quote, the righteous perish, Isaiah 57:1, because before we really die, we die so frequently. I am now the one who will function as the heir of the Luther name, and I am almost the oldest Luther in family. Not only coincidentally, but also in a legal perspective, I have the right to follow him through death into Christ's kingdom. He graciously grants us that right, though we are the most miserable among humanity and ashamed of the world." Interesting. Hey, Brother Norm, good evening, bud. Good evening. Hope you're doing well, or almost good morning to you. Reading a little bit about Martin Luther, his childhood, 1483 to 1500. Says there are not the words of someone who needs psychological or emotional recovery from his parents. Luther expressed the same sentiments to his mother in a later letter. It has been suggested that the lack of correspondence between Luther and his mother indicates a strained relationship, but this is an unnecessary interpretation. More likely, Luther's mother, like many others in her time, could not read. The depression and irritability that Luther would become known for are better attributed to extreme physical and mental stress, something to which many people today can surely relate. Luther's parents were not perfect, of course, but we are told that his father prayed with his children when they went to bed, and that his mother was known as a pious woman. In the context of all the strictness, it is piety, not cruelty, that characterized the Luther home. And now we got school. When Martin was 7 years old, his father sent him to the Latin school in Mansfeld. At this time, a Latin school represented the best chance for an elite education. It would prepare young students for a lifetime of scholarship. Though certainly Hans would have seen Latin school as a way to give his son a stable and strong future, Luther would later severely criticize his school years, calling them a time of torture, a time a child learned nothing more than a lot of nonsense. These schools were often harsh. Latin was hammered into students' heads and occasionally beaten in them with the rod. All right, Faye says I'm saying good night as I'm about to fall asleep here in my chair. Oh, good night, Sister Faye. Hope you have sweet dreams. Great night of sleep. See you in the morning. We'll see you in the morning. It says these schools were often harsh. Latin was hammered into students' heads and occasionally beaten into them with the rod. Luther recounted that one time he received 15 stripes because he did not know how to decline a number of Latin words, though he had never been taught how to do this. Yet the lessons in classics were not lost on him. Years later, Luther would relish the fables of the Greek poet Aesop, so much that he published them himself. The music of the school also made impression on the reformer, especially the Latin prayer that began and ended each day. Come, O Creator, Spirit blessed. which Luther eventually reworked and republished. Luther's World. This is Martin Luther, 1483 to 1500. Luther's World. Luther's childhood context was one of relative prosperity. Luther's family always had plenty of food, plenty of room, and plenty of funding for schools. Most of Luther's childhood friends were expected to work and earn income, as were a majority of children. Thus, literacy was often a privilege reserved for those who could afford it. It is difficult for most of us to imagine having few friends who can read or write, but that is the reality in which Luther lived. Luther's world was a world largely without written words. Very interesting. It says, page 32 of chapter 1, says, in the main, it was also a world without images. Images were typically seen only in church, and they likely only a wood cutting. A watery reflection or the mirroring of glass was the most that many people ever beheld. It was a world silent in the countryside, but carelessly noisy in the city. Luther's world was also a world of odors, a world in which brushing one's teeth was unknown, where people seldom washed or put on clean clothes. A world without underwear, where streets were open sewers, where fleas, flies, and lice were everywhere. The world at large did not offer Luther much, but it would become determinative for him. It was the world of the Holy Roman Emperor of the German nation, a name highlighting that it concerned the German portion of the old Roman Empire. The German part consisted of a great number of large and small political principalities, such as city-states, kingdoms, and duchies. This German Empire also included areas such as modern-day Hungary, the Czech Republic, Croatia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, parts of Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Though the emperor was the highest sovereign, each nation sought to act as independently as possible. Such independence was possible because the emperor was far removed. Emperor Charles V, for example, was a Spaniard who treated the German portion of his empire as a secondary concern, that is, until Luther launched his reforms. During a diet, a formal deliberative assembly, more than 100 sovereigns, princes, counts, and city representatives would gather under the chairmanship of the emperor to discuss imperial matters. For many years, these governors had received orders from the spiritual head seated in Rome, the Pope. In their opinion, the Roman rulers had too much political power, demanded too much German tax money, did not concern themselves sufficiently with spiritual matters, and were occupied instead with too many secular issues. Princes who didn't want to follow the Pope's demands only exacerbated internal strife. In the preceding century, there had been a number of attempts to institute political and ecclesiastical reform, but other than a few local revivals of piety, they had left no lasting impact. Under the surface of German social and religious life lay many explosive issues. Luther would be the one to ignite them. Very fascinating. Luther's world was evolving in more ways. The Middle Ages were being transformed into a new era. It should be noted that the so-called Dark Ages were often not as dark as its commentators have suggested. Likewise, monasteries were not as corrupt or lethargic as many anti-Catholic critics maintained, both then and later. That the situation was problematic, however, was generally accepted, and many felt that monasteries needed to be changed, at least to some degree. What this means is that the Reformation was not something that originated with Luther. Luther's arrival was not the beginning of demands for reform. Indeed, some reforms had actually begun before Luther's work. Accounts about such visitations, for example, reported improvements in the monasteries. Luther's work was, however, radically different from these other reforms. Luther was not content to merely fix abuses. He wanted to articulate an entirely different vision of man's relationship to God. Very nice. We're 34 minutes into this reading. The next portion is called Frightening. Frightening, page 33. Says when Martin was 13, his parents sent him to Magdeburg, a city at the time of approximately 25 to 30,000 inhabitants. He went there together with his friend from Mansfield, Hans Rennicke. I don't know if that's how you say that. Sorry. The city was growing stronger in Luther's time, often fortifying its walls. According to Luther, they entered a school of the, quote, brothers and sisters of the common life, end quote. But there was never such a school in Magdeburg. He did, however, live with people who were followers of the modern devotion. It was through this association that Luther became acquainted with the dysfunctions and corruptions of the church. He received Latin instruction at the local cathedral school. Otherwise, very little is known about Luther's stay at Magdeburg. One event in particular, though, left a deep impression on him. It says, when I went to school in Magdeburg in my 14th year, I myself saw one of the princes of Anhalt. Excuse me. It was the brother of the dean and the later bishop Adolf of Merseburg. He was walking on the Breitstrasse in a monk's tunic, begging for bread and carrying a cloth bag, much like a donkey carrying his load, so that he was constantly forced to bend over. His brother monks walked beside him and didn't carry anything, so that the pious prince alone was the best example that clearly showed the world what the meaning is of the raw reality of a holy life. In the monastery, they had given him such a lowly position that he had to perform the same chores as all the other brothers. Additionally, he had fasted so rigorously, kept vigils, and chastised himself so that he looked like death itself. He was not more than skin over bone and died shortly afterward. Whoever looked at him was stricken with silence and could only feel ashamed of his own situation. Interesting. Luther's stay in Magdeburg was short. A year later, his parents allowed him to move to Eisenach, probably under the watch of relatives there. Eisenach was small but had many churches and monasteries. Luther described Eisenach as a, quote, priest's nest and massive gathering of clerics. Luther attended the priest's school associated with St. Georgenkirch. That did not mean, however, that he was enrolled in the training for the priesthood, only that he would receive instruction to prepare him for higher study. As a student, he would also be engaged in the celebrations of Mass. Thus, Luther became involved in the veneration of Saint Anna, a popular saint at that time. Her veneration took place especially in the church that Luther attended. Most likely, Luther received accommodation in the house of Heinrich Schalby, a leading citizen of Eisenach, burgomaster of the city between 1495 and 1499. It is also possible that he was simply a frequent guest, because Schalby often allowed students to join his family for free meals. One of the residents in that house was Ursula Cotta, C-O-T-T-A, Cotta, Heinrich's daughter, and her husband, Kunz Cotta. Whether Luther was received in that house because Ursula had noticed him singing or begging, as was said, is not completely clear. Luther himself recounted that he had to earn money for his studies as Partenkeinstein, a word that is derived from the Latin word particula, which means part, whereas Hanks means horse. So Luther had to earn money by going door to door and singing, just as a horse neighs for a piece of bread. Though this kind of behavior was looked down on, Luther does not appear to have been ashamed of it. That's interesting. That's an interesting hustle. Knocking on people's door. May I sing for you? In Schalby household, Luther was exposed to the Franciscan monastery. The most important aspect of Luther's spiritual devotion, though, was his belief that Christ is, more than anything, a judge. Quote, ever since my childhood, I had gotten used to blanching and becoming frightened whenever I simply heard the name of Christ mentioned, for I had not been taught anything else other than that I had to see him as a strict and wrathful judge. End quote. This attitude also appears from one of the stories Luther told to make the message of the gospel clear. All right, here is, let's see, Georgian Kirch of Eisenbach. I guess that's the church building. Pretty cool. Yeah, pretty cool. Pretty cool. Says Christ offers himself to us with the forgiveness of sins, and nevertheless we still flee from his face. That's the way it was. Excuse me. That's the way it was when, as a boy still living at home, we went out to sing songs to collect sausages. Once someone called out to us with a joke, "What are you? What are you doing there, you rascals? Just you wait a moment." And at the same time, he approached us with two sausages. But my friends and I fled and ran away from him who came to us with a gift. In exactly the same manner, it is with us before God. He grants us Christ with all his gifts, and yet we flee away from him and see him as our judge. Oh, that's funny. All right, look, we're almost done the chapter. Okay, we're almost done the chapter. Let me finish this page, and we'll call it a night. 41 minutes into the reading. Says the question that haunted so many people in Luther's day, young and old alike, was whether they could do enough good to outweigh their sins and thus be acceptable to God. Therefore, it is scandalous that men under the papacy taught people to flee from Christ. I preferred that his name would not be mentioned within my hearing because they had instructed me in such a manner that I had to provide uh, satisfaction for my sins, and that on the last day Christ would say, quote, "How well did you keep the Ten Commandments? What's your condition?" Whenever someone described him to me, I was terrified of him, just like I was of the devil, because I could not bear his judgment. The terror made the sale of indulgences successful. To help people deal with temptations, special booklets were deployed, meant primarily for clerics to provide dying people with as much surety as possible. In Latin, these booklets were called Ars Moriendi, literally the art of dying well. Quote. Since most people could not read, these books contained pictures, which illustrated what Satan would try to do to make one's death bed a horror. The spirituality of Luther's culture was almost completely about awareness of sin and guilt, and ghastly images like these functioned to instill fear in spiritually dull people. In this context, Luther recounted that even as a child, he knew that playing cards and dancing were sins, and that one would have to confess these sins if he or she had hope of life after death. The Middle Ages may not have been as dark as they have often been portrayed, but from a spiritual perspective, the world in which young Martin Luther grew up was more like a haunted house than a playground. Fascinating. All right, so we finished that. Say finished. And we'll say it's technically 2/7/22, 12:25 a.m. Say Sunday night. And that was good reading. Interesting chapter about the beginning times of Martin Luther. Let's see, began, say, 11:40 p.m. on 2/6/22. Excellent. All right, cool. Well, thanks for tuning in. I'm going to try to go home, go to sleep, and get up in the morning for the Bible reading. So we have Bible reading tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time, 7 a.m. Central Time. So let me pray for you guys. Dear Lord, lift up everybody on the call this evening. Just pray that you bless them, encourage them, refresh them, give them strong faith, good physical health, a good mind, good emotions, good will, good relationships, and that they would, we would all lift your name up, glorify you well in all of our doings. So thank you for saving Martin Luther, how you did, and thank you so much just for his existence, and thanks for this biography we can read of So that's encouraging. Lord, just help us to persevere. May we find the time to go through this book and get everything from it that we can. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, friends. You guys have a great night. I'm going to the house. Talk to you later.